Meet Kong Chuizhong. According to official lineage records, he's considered the 79th generation direct descendant of none other than the great sage himself, Kongzi, better known in English as Confucius. I did consider saying great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson, but actually saying great 77 times, but I wasn't that committed to the joke. And you've probably been in that situation. You've heard somebody brag that they're related to somebody famous like Thomas Jefferson or Napoleon. Maybe you yourself are the third great-grand-cousin of, I don't know, Shakespeare. I've thought about this too. My last name is Henry, and my family has been obsessed with trying to find a link to the American founder, Patrick Henry. Turns out, there's probably not a link. There are a lot of Henrys. In the US, most people consider themselves lucky if they can trace their ancestry back before the Civil War. In parts of Europe, records often go back to the 1500s. But the Kong family claim to trace their ancestry back to Confucius, well, that is unparalleled, tracing back more than 80 generations ago to around 500 BCE, which actually has earned them a Guinness World Record for the longest documented family line. But how did this one lineage survive for more than 2 millennia? And what does it even mean to claim descent from somebody like Confucius? To answer that, we need to talk about the man himself. Quick refresher for anyone who's missed our earlier Confucianism video, but Kong is a family name and Zi simply means master. So Kongzi simply means Master Kong, a polite title for a scholar. In the West, we usually call him Confucius because early Jesuit missionaries introduced him to Europe through their Latin writings, which Latinized his name. Confucius lived sometime around 551 to 479 BCE, during what historians call the Spring and Autumn period. Now, the earliest source we have for his life was composed in the early 200s BCE, so take those dates with a grain of salt. That's a big gap between his purported lifetime and our first historical sources, but according to these later sources, he came from a noble but impoverished family. He was obsessed with history and ritual, and he saw in both the solution to the political chaos unfolding around him. During this time, feudal states organized themselves into a form of government kind of like the leagues of ancient Greek city-states. But by the lifetime of Confucius, this fragile order was unraveling. Local rulers were claiming grander titles, consolidating their territory, and maneuvering to become kings in their own right. The death of Confucius traditionally marks the transition into the so-called Warring States period, which is the very creative name for an era defined by open warfare among rival states, each hoping to unify China under their own dynasty. Confucius developed an ethical and social philosophy built around hierarchy, family relationships, and highly ritualized forms of behavior, what he saw as the foundations of a stable and harmonious society. But during his lifetime, he was not a celebrity sage we might imagine. He struggled to gain political traction, moving from state to state, searching for a ruler willing to put his ideas into practice. According to tradition, he eventually returned to his home state and devoted his final years to teaching and to preserving ancient texts. But even though Confucius wasn't a big deal during his own lifetime, his students energetically promoted his teachings and compiled them into a book that we now call the Analects. And over the next few centuries, Confucianism's political fortunes rose and fell. It was more popular during the Han Dynasty when it was made the state ideology in 140 BCE, but after the Han fell apart, Confucianism slipped out of the spotlight for a few centuries. But by the late 800s, scholars were nostalgic for the cultural golden age, the good old days of the Han Dynasty, and that meant taking a fresh look at Confucius and his ideas. That revival really took off during the Song Dynasty, when scholars of the time argued that China needed a moral reboot, arguing that moral self-cultivation and a return to classical Confucian ideals was the key to restoring Chinese strength and stability. And here's when the descendants of Confucius became a huge deal. To show their respect for Confucius, in 1055 CE, the Song court appointed Confucius's 43 times great-grandson, the Duke of Yancheng, meaning the Duke for fulfilling the sage. This was an honorary aristocratic title that placed the heir of Confucius at the center of state-sponsored rituals and gave the family formal responsibility for maintaining his temple and legacy. A title that was handed down from father to son and occasionally brother to brother or uncle to nephew until the position was officially abolished in 1935 by the nationalist government. 1055 to 1935, an amazing run as far as familial dynasties go. Now, the title officially had no political power, but the Kongs, they were a savvy savvy group. They knew that the soft power of sacred prestige could be leveraged into hard power, which they were able to do quite successfully for hundreds of years. The scholar Christopher Agnew, who literally wrote a book about the Kongs of Chufu, argues that we shouldn't view the Kong dukes as mere ceremonial figureheads. Although the title was technically honorary, the Kong lineage with the duke at its head basically acted like a centralized aristocratic government. They managed large hereditary estates around Chufu, administered the temple and cemetery of Confucius, and sometimes even wielded military power. In practice, this meant that the Kong lineage exercised real influence in local government. If politicians wanted to claim Confucius as their cultural ancestor, they had to negotiate with his actual descendants, who were very protective of their autonomy and their economic interests. Now, you historically minded people in the audience might have noticed that giant chronological gap. Confucius died around 479 BCE, and his descendant wasn't appointed Duke of Yensheng until 1055 CE. That's a gap of around 1500 years, and let's be honest, just because someone claims to be descended from a famous figure doesn't mean the paperwork holds up. The large gap in time is why scholars like Dr. Agnew only accept the genealogy going back to 1055. Historians think everything after this is a fairly historically accurate lineage, because the family lineage needed to be regularly maintained to establish the rightful holder of the title as Duke of Yensheng, as well as who was eligible for those sweet, sweet tax breaks and all those perks that went along with being a recognized descendant of Confucius. That said, the Kong family wasn't just relying on vibes and wishful thinking. We do have historical breadcrumbs that trace Confucius's descendants long before the Song dynasty. The historian Sima Qian, writing around 90 BCE, actually recorded the lineage up to his own time. Sima even knew one of Confucius's descendants personally, Kong Anguo, an 11th generation heir who had been honored by the emperor as a leading scholar. And it's not like there weren't challenges to maintaining family records after the establishment of the dukedom in 1055. Chinese history throws plenty of curveballs at anyone trying to keep a clean family record. In 1127, China basically split in half, with the north controlled by the Jurchen Jin dynasty and the south by the Song dynasty. Each side picked its own Duke of Yensheng. So suddenly there was a northern Confucius descendant and a southern Confucius descendant, both claiming to be the real deal. Then when the Mongols showed up, this led to the creation of yet another Duke of Yensheng, when the head of the northern lineage fled south. So for those of you keeping track, at one point you've got 3 different men all claiming to be the one true descendant of Confucius. Though eventually the Mongols conquered the southern Song in 1279 and declared their preferred candidate as the official duke. All of this really highlights the challenges of being part of the Kong family. Yes, the perks were real. Land, social prestige, and serious local influence. But the Kongs were not immune to social turmoil caused by larger political and economic shifts in China. Every time a new dynasty took power, they had to convince the new bosses that it was in the state's interest to keep honoring Confucius and to keep recognizing the Kong family's special status. Sometimes that was an easy sell, and sometimes it wasn't. The family fortunes generally followed the fortunes of the nation as a whole, meaning that they were in a much weakened state by the end of the 1800s. Their land was basically wrecked by a dramatic change in the Yellow River, which messed up their finances. At the same time, Confucianism itself was losing cultural steam. A lot of modern Chinese thinkers saw it as outdated and even harmful. They described it as something that was holding China back, preventing progress and leaving it open to European imperialism. One of the most famous critics was the writer Lu Xun, often considered the father of modern Chinese literature. In his 1918 story, Diary of a Madman, he equated Confucianism to cannibalism, with the strong literally devouring the weak while spouting the high-minded moralistic language of Confucianism. Lu Xun doubled down on this critique in another of his stories, Kong Yiji. The title character, Kong Yiji, is a would-be Confucian scholar who is portrayed as pathetic, pedantic, impoverished, and completely out of step with the modern world. By the end of the story, he's beaten so badly he dies, a pretty blunt metaphor for Lu's opinion on Confucianism in early 20th century China. Lu even said that the character Kong Yiji was inspired by a real scholar named Meng Fuzi. And the symbolism here is not exactly subtle. The fictional scholar shares a surname with Confucius himself, Kong, and Lu's supposed real-life inspiration carries the surname Meng, as in Mencius, the second most important figure in all of Confucianism after Confucius. Lu was making a point, and he wanted to make sure that readers didn't miss it. In 1935, the Republican government finally abolished the title of Duke of Yensheng. That hereditary rank looked too much like an aristocratic leftover from China's old feudal order, something the modernizing regime no longer wanted to maintain. And like many families, the Kongs were split by the Chinese Civil War between the nationalists and the communists. The
The last Duke of Yensheng, Kong Dezheng, fled to Taiwan with the nationalists, where his branch of the family has stayed ever since. For many years, he served as a presidential advisor in Taiwan and a professor of Chinese literature until his death in 2008. Today, his grandson, Kong Chuizhong, serves as the official head of the Kong lineage, with the modern title Sacrificial Official to Confucius. This title was invented by the nationalists in the 1930s to replace the Duke of Yensheng. Meanwhile, Kong Dezheng's sister, Kong Demao, remained near the ancestral home in Chufu in mainland China. Life for the descendants of Confucius became extremely difficult under the communist government, especially during the Cultural Revolution, when anything considered old or traditional was targeted. The Kong family was condemned as bourgeois parasitic landlords. The family mansion, temple, and cemetery were attacked, and the tomb of Confucius was destroyed, along with more recent family graves. The university student and prominent Red Guard leader Tan Holan led the assault on the Kong family compound. She declared, "We want to establish the ultimate authority of Mao Zedong's thought and topple the Kong family shop to its foundations. Burn the Confucian scholars, flatten the Kong's graves, haul out the Kong sycophants, and the reactionary authorities who worship Confucius, and parade them in the streets." It wasn't until the 1980s, as China began to relax its Cultural Revolution-era attitudes toward tradition, that the Kong family in mainland China could cautiously reclaim their identity as descendants of the nation's most famous sage. In fact, as I talk about in another video, Confucianism has made a real comeback in China over the last couple decades. There's been a major push for moral education grounded in Confucian values, along with a revived interest in Confucianism in general. Confucius has gone from being denounced as a symbol of feudal backwardness to being repurposed into an international ambassador of Chinese culture. There's even a ballet based on his life, choreographed by a 77th generation descendant. The Palace Museum in Beijing has also hosted multiple exhibits on Confucian culture, including a 2019 show that featured a miniature replica of a Confucius statue briefly installed in Tiananmen Square in 2011. As an aside, the full-size version mysteriously vanished one night just 4 months after it appeared. Apparently, even the most chill CCP officials were not thrilled about placing Confucius within eyesight of Mao's tomb, especially when Mao's last propaganda campaign was literally called "Criticize Lean, Criticize Confucius." Unsurprisingly, the Kong Family Association on the mainland, officially called the International Confucius Descendants Reunion Association, has actively supported this broader revival. And after decades of separation, Kong Chuizhong reconnected with his aunt, Kong Demao, before her death in 2021. And since 2011, the Taiwan and Chufu branches of the family have met regularly for reunions and ritual events at the old family compound. Kong himself has presided over the annual sacrifices at the Temple of Confucius on September 28th, Confucius's birthday, while other family members take part in celebrations across China. Many Kongs also attend conferences and international forums that promote Confucian studies. The association has even officially endorsed an AI Confucius that visitors can interact with at Mount Ni, the traditional birthplace of Confucius. So a lot of you have probably been asking, is any of this biologically real? Did today's Kongs actually inherit Confucius's DNA across 80 generations? And honestly, maybe. Geneticists point out that once you go back far enough, about 70 generations, everyone on Earth is related to everyone else. So in a purely statistical sense, all of us might be related to Confucius. Someone really needs to run that calculation. As I said earlier, historians like Christopher Agnew generally accept the lineage starting in 1055, when the Duke of Yensheng was first established. But for him, the biological question is actually the least interesting part. What fascinates him is the institution built around the lineage, the ongoing work of defining, claiming, and sustaining descent from the sage generation after generation. The Kongs oversaw the whole sacred landscape of Chufu, the temple, the cemetery, the sacrificial rites. They managed land, archives, rituals, and an entire local bureaucracy built around Confucius. This lineage didn't survive 1,000 years because of DNA, it survived because people kept building and rebuilding the system that made that lineage socially and politically powerful. And you really see the scale of that commitment in 2009, when the family completed a new 80-volume genealogy of Confucius's descendants. 80 volumes. 2 million names. Imagine the coordination, the record gathering, the negotiations, the sheer stubbornness required to maintain something like that across continents, regime changes, wars, and 2,500 years of Chinese history. Dr. Agnew draws a fascinating parallel to the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, the Al-Bayt, the Prophet's immediate family and their recognized heirs. Throughout history and across much of the Islamic world, belonging to this family conferred sacred authority, social prestige, tax exemptions, and real political influence.
Entire dynasties such as the Hashemites in Jordan have long grounded their legitimacy in this lineage. Millions of people today still trace their descent back to the Prophet's family. And just like the Kongs, the status of the Prophet's family depended on carefully curated genealogies and on the constant need to prove and protect descent from a sacred ancestor. Why so much focus on proving and protecting lineage? Well, Dr. Agnew puts it plainly. Once the Kong dukes gained real power, being a descendant of Confucius suddenly became very valuable. And when something becomes valuable, people discover relatives. Branches of the family tree suddenly reappear. Old lines of descent are, quote-unquote, found again. In other words, the more influence the Kongs had, the more work it took to maintain a legitimate genealogy and to defend it against challengers. And this leads to what I think is Dr. Agnew's most important point. Whenever lineage carries political weight, economic benefits, or moral and religious prestige, maintaining that lineage is never neutral. This is why Dr. Agnew asks near the end of his book, if the records were shaped by political agendas, does that undermine the genealogy? And his answer is not a simple yes or no. What he's really saying is, of course the genealogy is political. How could it not be? When a lineage is tied to land, privilege, ritual authority, and 1,000 years of state endorsement, the documents that support it will inevitably reflect those pressures. But that doesn't make the lineage meaningless. It just tells us what kind of thing it is. A genealogy is not just a DNA test, it's a social and political project. Because in the end, biological descent takes a back seat to the social identity of being a descendant of Confucius, and the 1,000-year effort of maintaining that identity and continually persuading both the state and the public that the descendants of Confucius constitute a real, coherent social body. So from a historical perspective, the miracle isn't that 2 million people today might share Confucius's DNA. The miracle is that the Kong family spent over a millennium making that relationship real, making it real socially, politically, and ritually. And that same question of who gets authority, who controls the narrative, and how legitimacy gets constructed is exactly what one of my favorite content creators has been covering in her new video on Bodycam YouTube. Now, if you don't know her already, Lindsay Ellis is a novelist, cultural critic, and longtime content creator, and these days she posts most of her video essays directly on Nebula. Her newest video looks at YouTube channels who make hundreds of thousands of dollars a month monetizing police body cam footage. Basically, these are the spiritual successors to the TV show Cops, treating police arrest footage not as a tool for accountability, but as a content pipeline that turns surveillance, humiliation, and violence into monetized entertainment. I'm gonna be honest, it's a deeply unsettling video, and it's exactly the kind of sharp, incisive, and necessary cultural criticism that makes Lindsay Ellis so amazing. And it's also exactly the sort of content that Nebula exists for. Nebula is a creator-owned streaming platform built by and for independent creators. We're a bunch of people, real, actual humans who have built a space to make top-tier prestige content. Right now that includes Nebula originals like Patrick Willem's The Dinner Plan, an independent film about a guy with a food allergy who's pressured into attending a dinner party, and spends the entire night trying to survive with one goal: don't throw up in front of everyone. Also, we have the travel competition show Jet Lag the Game. Season 16 premieres on December 17th, this time featuring a classic game of hide and seek across the United Kingdom. And we also have our new competition docuseries Scav. This is about the yearly University of Chicago scavenger hunt where extremely smart people deprive themselves of sleep to solve deeply unserious problems with alarming intensity. Nebula is a place for thoughtful, ambitious, and creative content like this, and if you've ever been curious, this December is the absolute best time to try. For the holidays, yearly subscriptions are now 50% off. With my link nebula.tv/literature4breakfast, you can get the whole year for just $30, which works out to be about $2.50 a month. We also offer lifetime memberships. They usually cost $500, but with my link you can get them for 40% off for $300. Again, that's nebula.tv/literature4breakfast. You'll get access to everything on Nebula, and you'll also directly support creators like Lindsay and myself. Thanks, everyone.